There is a kind of silence that only a woman who has longed for a child can truly understand. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of contentment. It is the silence of a house that should have had little feet running through it. The silence of a nursery that was painted but never used. The silence of a woman who lay awake at 3 in the morning wondering what she did wrong, wondering why her body kept betraying her, wondering if the man who vowed to love her in sickness and in health was quietly counting the days until he could find a reason to walk away. This is the story of Margaret Collins, a woman from a quiet suburb outside of Nashville, Tennessee, who loved deeply, who prayed harder than most people could imagine, and who was ultimately cast aside by the one person who had promised to stay. But what happened next? What happened after he left her, after he remarried, after he told her she was nothing without the ability to give him a child, is the kind of story that will leave you sitting in your chair, unable to move, unable to breathe, wondering if what you just heard could possibly be true. And it is. Every single word of it is true. So do not go anywhere, because this story is only just beginning. Here are the questions that are going to haunt you for the next hour and a half. Why would a man who stood at an altar and looked into the eyes of the woman he claimed to love, why would he look at her 5 years later and say the words that no wife should ever have to hear? Why would he call her broken? Why would he tell her she was less than a woman because her body could not do what he demanded of it? And here is the one that will keep you up tonight. What happened 7 years after he left her for another woman? A woman he believed could give him the children he so desperately wanted. When Margaret Collins knocked on a door she had never expected to knock on again, carrying something he never saw coming, we are going to answer all of those questions. But to understand where this story ends, you have to understand where it began. You have to understand who Margaret was before the pain. You have to understand who Travis Collins was before the cruelty. And you have to understand the moments, the small, quiet moments, where the cracks in this marriage first appeared, long before anyone else in their lives could see them. Margaret and Caldwell was born in 1974 in Clarksville, Tennessee, the second of 3 daughters raised by a schoolteacher mother and a father who drove long-haul trucks and came home on weekends smelling like diesel and coffee and the road. She grew up in a house where love was not a complicated concept. Her mother made Sunday dinner every week without fail. Her father read to her and her sisters every night he was home. She learned early what a family looked like, what it sounded like, what it felt like to sit at a table surrounded by people who chose to be there. By the time she graduated from Austin Peay State University in 1996 with a degree in elementary education, Margaret had her life mapped out with the kind of gentle certainty that belongs only to those who have never yet been truly broken. She would teach. She would fall in love. She would get married. She would have children. She would recreate the Sunday dinners, the bedtime stories, the warm and sturdy life her parents had given her. That was the plan. And for a while, for a beautiful, hopeful, heartbreaking while, it seemed like the plan was working. Travis James Collins entered Margaret's life in the summer of 1997 at a 4th of July cookout, hosted by a mutual friend in the Germantown neighborhood of Nashville. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, with a slow smile and the kind of easy confidence that made rooms tilt slightly in his direction when he walked in. He sold commercial real estate. He drove a clean black pickup truck. He called his mother every Sunday. He seemed, by every measure that Margaret had learned to trust, like the right kind of man. They dated for 2 years. He proposed on Christmas Eve of 1999, down on one knee in front of her parents' fireplace with a ring he had spent 3 months paying off. Margaret said yes before he finished the sentence. They were married in June of 2000 at a small church just outside of Nashville. 53 people attended. Her youngest sister was the maid of honor. Travis cried during his vows. Margaret would remember that for the rest of her life, the fact that he cried. She would hold on to that memory during the years that followed, during the arguments and the silences and the appointments and the disappointments, and she would keep returning to it as proof that somewhere inside the man she married, there had once been something real. The first year of their marriage was, by all accounts, exactly what Margaret had imagined. They bought a house in a good school district, which felt like a statement of faith, a declaration of intention. They planted a garden in the backyard. They talked about names. Travis wanted a boy first. Margaret said she did not care as long as the baby was healthy. They started trying in the spring of 2001, confident in the way that young, Healthy people in love are always confident, certain that nature would cooperate, that this part of the plan would unfold the way the rest of it had. It did not. The first 6 months passed without a pregnancy, and neither of them worried. Their doctor told them this was completely normal. Keep trying. Relax. Don't overthink it. So they tried not to overthink it. They went on a trip to the Smoky Mountains. They had dinners with friends. They laughed at each other's jokes. But month after month, the same result arrived, and the anxiety that Margaret had been keeping carefully managed began to press against the edges of her days. By the end of 2001, she had made an appointment with a reproductive endocrinologist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. The tests began: blood draws, ultrasounds, hormone panels, dye injections to check the fallopian tubes. Travis was tested too. He would make a point of telling people that later, that he had been tested, that his results had come back normal, as though the normalcy of his results was evidence of something about his character rather than simply a fact about his biology. Margaret's results were more complicated. She was diagnosed with a condition called premature ovarian insufficiency, a condition in which the ovaries stop functioning normally before a woman reaches the age of 40. Her egg reserves were severely diminished. Her hormone levels were irregular. The doctors sat across from Margaret and Travis in a beige office with framed prints of wildflowers on the walls and explained, carefully and compassionately, that conceiving naturally would be very difficult, and that their best options involved assisted reproductive technology, IVF, donor eggs, or adoption. Margaret remembered the exact quality of light in that room. She remembered the sound of Travis breathing beside her. She remembered reaching for his hand and feeling him take it, and she thought in that moment that they were going to face this together. She was not yet paying attention to the way his jaw had tightened. She was not yet reading the particular silence that had settled over him like a weather system. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Before we go deeper into Margaret's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us talk about what happened over the next 3 years, because this is the part of the story where the real cracks become fractures, and where Margaret would later say she first understood that the man she had married was not the man she had believed him to be. They attempted IVF twice between 2002 and 2004. The first round failed. Margaret handled it with a composure that frightened even her. She returned to her classroom the following Monday, read to her second graders, graded their spelling tests, drove home, and then sat in the driveway for 45 minutes before she could make herself go inside. The second round also failed, and this time the composure cracked. She cried for 3 days. Travis was in the house during those 3 days. He was physically present. But Margaret would say afterward that she had never felt more alone in her life than she did in that house, with that man, who did not seem to know what to do with her grief and had therefore decided to keep a careful distance from it. The conversations began to change. At first, they were quiet and careful, the kind of conversations that couples have when they are both trying not to say the wrong thing and end up saying nothing meaningful at all. But gradually, over months, Travis began saying things that Margaret would carry with her. For years, he said he had always imagined being a father. He said he had not signed up for a life without children. He said the two of them needed to be realistic about what their future looked like. He never said the word barren, not at first. That word came later. It came on a Tuesday night in March of 2005, after a dinner where neither of them had spoken much, when Travis put down his fork and looked across the table at Margaret and said, quietly, almost gently, as though the quietness and the gentleness could cushion the impact of the words themselves, that he did not think he could stay in a marriage that was not going to give him a family. He said he needed to be honest with her. He said she was barren and he needed a woman who was not. Margaret told me, and she told this story with the same clear, careful voice of a woman who has processed something so thoroughly that it no longer has the power to shatter her, only to ache, that she did not cry immediately. She said she sat very still. She said she looked at the candle burning on the table between them and thought about the fact that she had bought those candles at a Tuesday morning store on sale for $3, and she remembered being pleased about finding them, and she thought about how strange it was that her mind was in a Tuesday morning store while her marriage was ending at the dinner table. Travis Collins filed for divorce in the spring of 2005. He cited irreconcilable differences, which is what people cite when the real reason is something they cannot write on a legal document without it looking as ugly on paper as it sounds out loud. The divorce was finalized by September of that year. Margaret kept the house for 2 years and then sold it. She could not maintain the mortgage alone on a teacher's salary, and besides, she had painted that nursery. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Nashville and started over from the bottom of the emotional canyon that Travis had dropped her into. She continued teaching. She continued going to church. She continued calling her mother every evening and letting her mother do most of the talking, because Margaret did not yet have the words for what had happened to her. Her colleagues at school noticed the change in her. She had always been the kind of teacher who brought extra energy into the classroom, who remembered which child's grandfather had been sick, who stayed late to help struggling readers. She still did all of those things. But there was something behind her eyes that had not been there before, a guardedness, a careful management of her own enthusiasm, as though she had learned that hope was a resource that needed to be rationed. Travis, meanwhile, did not wait long. Within 8 months of the divorce being finalized, he was dating a woman named Cheryl, a dental hygienist from Franklin, Tennessee, who was 31 years old and had 2 children from a previous relationship and was, as far as anyone in Travis's circle could see, perfectly healthy and fertile and exactly what Travis had decided he needed. They were engaged within a year. They were married 18 months after that. And in 2008, Cheryl gave birth to a baby boy. Travis Collins became a father. He posted a photograph on Facebook. This was the early days of Facebook, when people were still figuring out how much of their lives to put on the internet. And the photograph was of him holding his newborn son in the hospital, with the wide, stunned, grateful expression of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted. Margaret saw the photograph. She was not sure why she looked. She would ask herself that question for years afterward. But she looked. And then she closed the laptop and did not look again for a very long time. Because Margaret Collins was not finished. Not even close. What do you do when the person who was supposed to be your partner in life decides that your body's limitations are sufficient grounds for abandonment? What do you do when the medical community has told you that the thing you wanted most, the thing you had structured your entire imagined future around, is not going to happen in the way you planned? What do you do with a grief that does not announce itself the way ordinary grief does? That does not have a funeral or a casserole delivery or a card from the neighbors, but instead sits inside you quietly, rearranging your furniture, moving things to rooms you do not know how to access. Margaret Collins did what she had always done. She went back to work. She cared for other people's children. She read to them and wiped their noses and celebrated their small victories with the full force of her attention, and she let herself love them in the particular way that teachers love, openly, temporarily, knowing that they will come and go and that the love is real regardless. But the nights were long. The weekends were longer. Margaret threw herself into her school's literacy program, developing a reading curriculum that would eventually be adopted by 3 other elementary schools in the district. She started running, not for fitness exactly, but for the particular mercy of physical exhaustion, the way a long run can temporarily empty the mind of everything it has been carrying. She ran her first half marathon in the fall of 2006. She ran 3 more in the years that followed. She joined a grief support group through her church, not a group specifically for infertility, though those existed and she would find them eventually, but a general grief group, because her pastor had gently suggested that what she was carrying qualified as grief and deserved to be treated as such. In that group, she met women who had lost husbands, men who had lost parents, a young couple who had lost a child, and a woman named Darlene who had lost her marriage in circumstances not entirely unlike Margaret's own. Darlene became one of the most important people in Margaret's life. She was 62 years old, sharp-tongued and clear-eyed and deeply funny, and she had been through enough of her own suffering that she had no patience for sentimentality but an enormous capacity for truth. Darlene told Margaret things that her other friends and family, out of kindness, had not told her. She told her that she was grieving correctly. She told her that the grief would not end, but that it would change shape. She told her that Travis Collins had done Margaret a profound and irreversible favor, even if it did not feel that way yet, because she had now learned the exact shape of his character and she would never have to wonder about it again. In 2007, 2 years after the divorce, Margaret began seeing a therapist named Dr. Sandra Okafor. a reproductive psychologist in Nashville who specialized in helping women navigate the emotional dimensions of infertility. This was not, Margaret would later say, the easiest thing she had ever done. She was from a generation and a culture and a church tradition in which personal suffering was something you took to God in prayer and to your family in carefully edited versions, not to a stranger in a carpeted office who asked you how things made you feel. But she went, and she kept going. And somewhere in those sessions, in those conversations that went to the places Margaret had been carefully not going, something began to shift. What she discovered, slowly and sometimes painfully, was that her identity had become so entwined with her desire to be a mother that she had lost track of who she was in the absence of that desire. She had defined herself by what her body could not do, which meant she had accepted Travis's definition, that a woman who could not bear children was somehow incomplete. Dr. Okafor was the first person who looked Margaret directly in the face and told her that was a lie. Not a gentle lie, not a forgivable misunderstanding, but a fundamental, culturally enforced lie about the nature of womanhood and worth, and Margaret had every right to reject it entirely. It took time. It took more time than Margaret wanted it to take. But by 2008, the same year that Travis Collins was posting photographs of his newborn son on the internet, Margaret Collins was doing something she had not done in years. She was beginning, quietly and carefully, and with full awareness of how fragile the process was, to rebuild herself. She started looking into adoption, not yet as a formal process, but as a possibility she allowed herself to consider without immediately dismissing it. She attended an information session at a local adoption agency. She sat in a room with other couples and single adults and listened to a social worker explain what the process involved, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, the particular quality of hope that is different from wishful thinking, more honest, more grounded, more aware of the cost, but hope nonetheless. She did not move forward with it immediately. She was not ready, but she had opened a door. Now here is where the story takes a turn that nobody in Margaret's life saw coming. In the spring of 2009, Margaret met a man named David at a conference for educators in Memphis. He was a school principal from Knoxville, 42 years old, divorced, with 2 adult daughters from his first marriage who were in college. He was not Travis Collins. He was quieter, more deliberate, less immediately magnetic, and he listened in the particular way that people who have been through their own version of heartbreak learn to listen, with their whole bodies, like someone who understands what it means to need to be heard. They exchanged numbers. They had a phone call that lasted 3 hours on a Wednesday night in April. They drove to meet each other in Cookeville, which was roughly halfway between Nashville and Knoxville, on a Saturday. In May, and they sat in a diner and talked for 5 hours, and Margaret drove home on Interstate 40 in the early evening with the windows down, thinking that she had not felt this particular feeling in a very long time. They dated carefully, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of 2 people who have both learned expensive lessons about moving too fast. Margaret told David about her infertility earlier than she told most people, because she had learned from her marriage to Travis that this was information that needed to be on the table before anyone started building anything on top of it. David did not flinch. He said he had his children. He said what mattered to him was finding a partner, someone to build a life with, someone who would still be sitting across the table from him in 30 years. Margaret cried when he said that, and she was not entirely sure whether she was crying because it was exactly what she had needed to hear, or because she was still not sure she believed it could be true. They continued seeing each other. And then, in the fall of 2009, something happened that none of them were expecting. In October of 2009, Margaret Collins went to her gynecologist for a routine annual exam, the kind of appointment that most women make and keep without anticipating anything other than the ordinary inconvenience of it. She had been having some irregular symptoms that she had been attributing to stress. Some nausea, some fatigue. A period that was late, which was not unusual for her given her hormonal history, and which she therefore did not allow herself to read too much into. Her doctor ran a panel of tests. A few days later, Margaret's phone rang, and her doctor was on the other end of the line, and she said 4 words that Margaret Collins had spent 8 years believing she would never hear directed at her. She said, "You are expecting, Margaret." Margaret did not speak for approximately 30 seconds. Her doctor asked if she was still there, and Margaret said yes, she was there, and her doctor began explaining. Misdiagnosis of severity, secondary hormonal fluctuation, the particular and documented medical phenomenon in which ovaries that have been declared severely compromised can, under circumstances that are not fully understood even by reproductive specialists, produce viable eggs. And Margaret was listening, or she was trying to listen, but the primary thing happening in her body in that moment was not listening. It was something much older and more physical than listening. She was shaking. She was 35 years old. She was pregnant. She had been told for 8 years that this was not going to happen for her. She had built her entire post-divorce life on the acceptance of that fact, had done the hard internal work of making peace with it, had redefined her sense of worth and womanhood outside of it. And now she was sitting in her car in the parking lot of a Kroger in East Nashville with a phone in her hand and a doctor's voice in her ear telling her that the fact she had accepted was not entirely a fact after all. The pregnancy was high risk. Margaret's doctor referred her immediately to a maternal-fetal medicine specialist, a perinatologist, and a team that would monitor her more carefully than most pregnancies are monitored because of her age, her hormonal history, and the fact that everything about this pregnancy was medically anomalous. She was placed on progesterone supplementation. She had ultrasounds every 2 weeks. She was told to avoid stress, which she found grimly funny given the circumstances. David was with her through all of it. He had been the first person she called after she sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes and finally stopped shaking enough to dial. He drove from Knoxville to Nashville that same evening and sat with her on her couch, and they looked at each other in the particular way that people look at each other when something has happened that is too large for ordinary language. He said he was not going anywhere. He said this in the same quiet, deliberate way he said everything, and Margaret believed him with a completeness that she had not believed anyone in a very long time. But before we continue, before we get to what happened next, there is a piece of this story that has been waiting in the background since the beginning, and this is the moment where it arrives. Because while Margaret Collins was navigating the most unexpected chapter of her life, Travis Collins was having a chapter of his own. His marriage to Cheryl, which had begun with so much apparent purpose and conviction, had been unraveling for 2 years. The boy Travis had held in that Facebook photograph, his son, the proof of his decision, the justification he had offered himself, and Margaret and everyone else for the choices he had made. That boy was 4 years old now, and Travis was living in a rental apartment in Brentwood and paying child support and commuting to see his son on weekends. Because Cheryl had filed for divorce citing Travis's emotional unavailability and a level of self-absorption that she had apparently been documenting in her journals for 3 years before she finally decided she had documented enough. A mutual acquaintance, a woman who had been a bridesmaid at Margaret's wedding and had, with some discomfort, remained loosely connected to both of them through the tight geography of Nashville's social circles, told Margaret about the divorce. Not maliciously, just in the way that information travels in a city where everyone knows someone who knows someone. Margaret received this information while she was approximately 4 months pregnant. She sat with it for a long time before she decided what to do with it. And here is where the story reveals something important about who Margaret Collins was, and who she had become through everything she had endured. Because the thing she felt most strongly when she sat with the news of Travis's second divorce was not satisfaction. She had expected to feel satisfaction. She had imagined, during the darker periods of the years following her own divorce, that if she ever heard that Travis's second marriage had failed, she would feel something vindicating and sharp. What she actually felt was much closer to sadness. Sadness for his son. Sadness for the wreckage that a man's inability to examine himself honestly can leave behind. And a quiet, steely resolve that she was going to do the exact thing she was doing. Build a life that was real and honest and chosen, and she was not going to spend one more hour of it thinking about Travis Collins. She went back to her prenatal appointment. She scheduled her next ultrasound. She called David and told him about it, and he said the right thing, which was nothing except her name said in a voice that understood everything. And then he asked if she wanted him to bring dinner. He brought dinner. Margaret Collins gave birth to a daughter in May of 2010. She named her Rose Ellen Collins. Ellen for her mother. Rose because Margaret had planted roses in the garden of the house she had shared with Travis and had always thought of them as the most honest flowers, the ones that did not pretend the thorns were not there. Rose was born 6 weeks early, which had been anticipated and prepared for. She spent 11 days in the neonatal intensive care unit at Vanderbilt, and during those 11 days, Margaret and David sat together in a NICU waiting room, and they held hands, and they did the specific, private work of two people deciding, without saying it directly, that they were going to be a family. Rose came home in June. She was the size of a sweet potato and had Margaret's dark eyes and screamed at a volume that seemed physically impossible for a creature so small. Margaret would later say that the sound of that screaming was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard in her life, because it meant her daughter had opinions and the lungs to express them. David proposed to Margaret that September. He got down on one knee in the kitchen of her apartment while Rose was asleep in the other room, and he said that he had been thinking about this for a long time and that he was not going to keep thinking about it. Margaret said yes before he finished the sentence, which she noted with some private amusement was exactly what she had done the first time, and then she noted with a more significant private recognition that the similarities ended precisely there. They were married the following spring. Small ceremony. Close family. Margaret's youngest sister was again the maid of honor. Margaret did not compare it to her first wedding in any way that was not in the new wedding's favor. And then, the part of this story that still makes people stop when they hear it, Travis Collins called. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November of 2011. Margaret was at the kitchen table helping one of her students' parents understand a learning plan, because Margaret was the kind of teacher who gave her number to parents and actually answered it, and the number she did not recognize turned out to belong to Travis. She stepped outside onto the small porch of the house she and David had bought together the previous summer, and she stood in the cold November air and said hello, and Travis said her name, and then he said he was sorry. He said he had been wanting to call for 2 years. He said he had heard she had a daughter, and that she had remarried, and that she was. And here he used a word that Margaret had not expected him to use, that she was flourishing. He said he wanted her to know that he understood now what he had done. Not just the fact of the divorce, but the way he had done it, the things he had said, the word he had used, the fundamental wrongness of deciding that her value as a partner was contingent on her biology. He said he did not expect her forgiveness. He said he was not calling to ask for anything. He just wanted her to know that he understood, and that he was sorry. Margaret stood on the porch in the November cold for a moment after he finished speaking, and she thought about what she wanted to say, and she thought about the woman who had stood in her kitchen 8 years earlier not crying because her mind had retreated to a Tuesday morning store. And then she said something that Travis Collins had not expected. She said she accepted his apology, not because what he had done was acceptable, not because the damage was undone or even fully repaired, but because carrying his guilt as a permanent fixture in her own chest would cost her something she was no longer willing to spend. She said she hoped his son was well. She said she hoped Travis found a way to be the person his son needed him to be. And then she went back inside to finish her meeting, and she put the phone in her pocket, and David looked up from where he was making dinner and looked at her face, and she said, "I'll tell you later," and he nodded and went back to the stove. She told him later. He said the right things. He always said the right things. Here is the thing about Margaret Collins that you need to understand as this story moves toward its close. She did not become defined by what had been done to her. She was aware of it. She did not minimize it or pretend it had not shaped her in fundamental and sometimes painful ways. But she made a deliberate, effortful choice not to let it be the primary story of her life. In 2013, 3 years after Rose was born, Margaret began speaking publicly about infertility and the particular cruelty of relationships in which a partner's worth is measured by their fertility. She was not a public speaker by training or by inclination. She was a second-grade teacher, but she had been asked to share her story at a Resolve support group meeting. Resolve is the National Infertility Association, a nonprofit that supports people navigating fertility challenges, and she had agreed, and she had stood in a church fellowship hall in Nashville in front of 38 women and 8 men, and she had told them the truth. All of it. The diagnosis, the IVF, the marriage ending, the years of rebuilding, the unexpected pregnancy, the daughter who was now 3 years old and had recently discovered that the word no was available to her and was testing its range with considerable enthusiasm. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when everyone in them is recognizing themselves in someone else's story. 3 different women came up to her afterward and said some version of the same thing. I thought I was the only one. Margaret drove home that evening and told David about it, and he said, as he always said the right things, that she should keep doing it. And so she did. Because this is a documentary, we owe you the factual context. We have been telling you this is a true story, and it is. And we want to give you the medical framework that explains how it was possible. Premature ovarian insufficiency, the condition with which Margaret was diagnosed, is not the same as premature ovarian failure, though the terms are sometimes used interchangeably in ways that are not entirely accurate. Women with POI, as it is abbreviated, do not always stop producing eggs entirely. Their ovarian function is diminished and erratic, but studies have shown that approximately 5 to 10% of women diagnosed with this condition will conceive spontaneously at some point after diagnosis. The medical community has historically communicated this diagnosis in ways that left women with little to no hope, and that communication has not always reflected the full complexity of the condition. Margaret's doctors did not lie to her. They gave her their best assessment based on the information they had at the time. But the information was incomplete, as medical information about female reproductive health has often been incomplete, as research in this area has historically been underfunded and underemphasized. This is not a small point. This is something that Margaret spoke about explicitly in her advocacy work. The assumption that a diagnosis of infertility is permanent and absolute, particularly for women, has caused immeasurable harm. It has ended marriages that did not need to end. It has sent women into decades of grief for a future they had been told was impossible. In some cases, it has been correct. In Margaret's case, it was not entirely correct. And the difference between those two outcomes was not in the medical facts alone. It was in what Margaret, and the people who loved her, chose to do in the space between the diagnosis and the future. Rose Collins is 14 years old now. She is, by all accounts from the people who know her, a great deal like her mother, opinionated, warm, with a fierce sense of justice and a laugh that takes over her whole face. She plays the viola in her school orchestra and has the particular kind of intensity about it that suggests she takes it more seriously than she lets on. Margaret and David have been married for 13 years. They live in a house with a garden in the backyard and roses that come back every spring regardless of the winters. Margaret retired from the classroom 4 years ago and now works full-time with an infertility support nonprofit she co-founded with Darlene, who is now 73 years old and has not become 1 degree less sharp-tongued or clear-eyed. The nonprofit provides counseling referrals, support groups, and advocacy resources to women and couples navigating fertility challenges, with a particular focus on making sure that women in those situations understand that a medical diagnosis does not define their worth, their womanhood, or the possible shapes of their futures. Travis Collins, by the last available accounting, is living in the greater Nashville area. He has a relationship with his son. Beyond that, this story does not concern itself much with Travis Collins, because this story was never really about him, even when it felt like it was. It was always about Margaret. It was about what happens when a woman is told that she is not enough, and she decides, quietly, stubbornly, without an audience, that she is going to find out for herself whether that is true. And now here is the question we want to leave you with, the one we want you to sit with after this video ends, the one we want you to take into your own life and examine from whatever angle it fits. We are not asking this to be provocative. We are asking it because we think it matters. How many people in your life, right now, have been told a version of the story that Margaret was told, that they are less than, that they are broken, that the thing they cannot do defines the sum total of what they are, and have believed it? And what would it mean if they stopped? To understand the full depth of this story, you have to understand what it is like to live inside an experience that the people around you do not have a complete language for. Infertility in America is, in many communities and in many generations, a subject that people know how to feel about more easily than they know how to talk about. The cultural script is well worn. Try harder, relax more, adopt a baby, and you'll get pregnant on your own. Everything happens for a reason. God has a plan. These are not said with malice. They are said with discomfort, with a desire to be helpful, with the particular human impulse to resolve what looks like pain by offering it a framework that contains it. Margaret heard all of these things. She was gracious about hearing them, mostly because she understood that the people saying them were doing the best they could with the tools they had. But what she wanted, what she could not get from any of those scripts, was someone who would simply sit with her in the reality of what was, without trying to explain it away or silver line it or position it as a step toward something better. Darlene gave her some of that. Dr. Okafor gave her more of it. And when she sat in those pews at her church on Sunday mornings during the years between her divorce and Rose's birth, and the sermon was about faith in the face of what appears to be barrenness, and the congregation said amen, Margaret sometimes thought about what it would mean for a congregation to apply that sermon to a living woman in its midst rather than to an ancient biblical figure. She thought about Hannah, whose story she had known since childhood. Hannah, who wept at the temple, who was so desperate in her prayer that the priest Eli thought she was drunk. Hannah, who finally gave her son to God in fulfillment of a vow made in a moment of absolute desperation. She had always found that story comforting as a child. As an adult woman being told her womb was compromised, she found it more complicated because the comfort of the story depended on the ending, and for a long time, Margaret could not see her ending. The women in the Bible who were barren eventually conceived. The story always moved toward conception. What was the story for a woman for whom conception was not going to be the resolution? Margaret sat with that question through long nights in her apartment, through half marathons, run in the early morning dark, through therapy sessions where Dr. Okafor pushed her gently and persistently toward an answer that did not depend on a pregnancy. The answer she found, slowly and incompletely, and with a great deal of revision, was this: the story is not about the womb. It was never about the womb. It was about the woman, and the woman's story was still being written. Extended narrative. The women who came before, 75:00, 85:00. Margaret was not alone in what she experienced. She was part of a long and largely unacknowledged tradition of women in America who have been discarded or diminished because of their inability to conceive, and who have had to find their own way to a life that the culture around them was not very good at helping them imagine. According to the Centers for Disease Control, approximately 12% of women of reproductive age in the United States have difficulty getting pregnant or carrying a pregnancy to term. That is nearly 1 in 8 couples. 1 in 8. And yet the conversation about infertility, about the emotional devastation of it, about the way it can destabilize marriages, about the way a diagnosis can be weaponized by a partner who decides that their own desire for children outweighs their commitment to the person they married. That conversation is still, in many spaces, conducted in whispers. The marriages that have ended because of infertility are not counted in any official statistic. The divorces that were filed citing irreconcilable differences when the real reason was one partner's refusal to stay with someone who could not bear children. Those are not tracked, not documented, not discussed in any sustained cultural way. They happen, quietly and regularly, in good school districts and church communities and book clubs, and the women on the receiving end of them go home to their apartments and their single mortgages and their grief that does not have a funeral, and they figure it out. Margaret figured it out. Christine Zellman, who endured 6 rounds of IUI and 3 rounds of IVF and was told repeatedly that her body was failing her, she figured it out. The woman from Tennessee who had a 0.4% chance of conceiving naturally and then, having gotten herself into the best shape of her life while preparing for her last IVF embryo transfer, found herself pregnant without the transfer at all. She figured it out. These women did not figure it out because the path was clear, or because the culture was supportive, or because the right resources were always available. They figured it out because women who are told that they are not enough have a long history of deciding to prove that assessment spectacularly wrong. And we think that is worth more than a passing acknowledgement. We think that is worth 90 minutes of your time. Closing reflection, 85:00, 90:00. Margaret Collins was asked once, by a journalist writing a piece about her nonprofit, what she would say to the version of herself who sat at the dinner table in 2005 and heard her husband use the word barren. She thought about it for a long time, not performing the thinking, actually thinking, in the way she always did, with her whole face in a stillness that David had told her was one of the things he loved most about her. And then she said this: I would tell her that he named her wrong. He called her barren, but she was not barren. She was between harvests. The harvest was coming. She just could not see it yet. And I would tell her, I would make sure she understood this, that even if the harvest never came, even if Rose had never been born, even if the doctors had been entirely right, and there had been no pregnancy, no daughter, No viola-playing teenager stealing the good throw blanket off the couch. Even then, she would not have been barren. Because barren means empty. And she was never empty. She was full of things that Travis Collins could not see and therefore decided did not exist. She was full of every child she had ever taught to read. She was full of every half marathon she had ever run in the early morning dark. She was full of her mother's voice on the phone in the evenings and Darlene's sharp, clear laughter and the roses that came back every spring. She was full of herself. And that, it turns out, was more than enough to build a life on. There is a woman watching this right now who has been told she is not enough. She has been told it by a partner, by a diagnosis, by a culture that measures her worth in the wrong units. And if you are that woman, we want you to hear this. Margaret Collins did not get her life back by proving Travis Collins wrong. She got her life back by refusing to let Travis Collins be the authority on what her life was worth. That is a choice. It is not an easy choice, but it is available. It has always been available. And on the other side of it, there is a garden. There are roses. There is a daughter who laughs with her whole face. And there is a Tuesday in November when a man who once called you barren calls back to tell you he finally understands what that word cost you. And you stand in the cold on your own porch, in your own life, with your own dinner being made inside by the right person, and you accept the apology not for him, but for yourself. Because you are done carrying what belongs to him. This has been the story of Margaret Collins. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, if it made you think about the words we use and the value we assign to the people in our lives, please leave a comment below. Tell us what part of this story stayed with you. Tell us what question it left you with. Ask what you would have done differently. We read every single comment. And subscribe if you have not. Because the next story we are going to tell you is the one about a woman who was told she had 6 months to live, and what she did with those 6 months that nobody in the hospital saw coming. You do not want to miss that one. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying. And remember, every story that begins with someone telling you what you cannot be is a story that is not finished yet.